The Welrod pistol existed for controlled killing operations. It was created as a specialist assassination instrument. British planners defined its requirements in precise memoranda. The customer was the Special Operations Executive Branch. The intended users were resistance cells and special forces. Conventional infantry units were not briefed about it. The concept began with a simple problem statement: eliminate selected individuals without revealing shooter presence. Avoid muzzle flash, loud report and recognisable weapon silhouette. Permit contact shots against guarded or sleeping targets. Allow simple concealment during transit and exfiltration. Prevent forensic linking to British industrial suppliers. The design bureau responsible was Station 9 Welwyn. Engineers there already handled clandestine weapons projects. The Welrod name followed internal well prefix conventions. The suffix rod reflected generic slang for firearms. Documents minimized descriptive language to maintain operational secrecy. Engineers specified a bolt-action, manually cycled system. A self-loading pistol was rejected for noise reasons. The sliding mass and cycling springs produced unwanted sound. Ejected cases could also compromise immediate deniability. Bolt-action removed these issues through operator-controlled cycling. The final geometry resembled an elongated tubular cylinder. Overall diameter was approximately 30 mm external. Length for production patterns reached around 300 mm. Weight sat near 1 kg unloaded for .32 caliber. This produced a dense, tool-like object without obvious grip. The steel tube was divided into internal functional zones. At the rear sat the manually rotated bolt. Ahead of that lay a short ported barrel section. Forward again stretched the primary expansion and baffle stack. Threaded collars locked these segments within the main tube. Material choice prioritized machinability and dimensional stability. Mild steel tube stock was centerless ground for uniformity. Critical components used higher-grade alloy steel billets. Heat treatment cycles were tightly controlled on production drawings. Surface finish generally used parkerizing or comparable phosphate treatment. The barrel itself was notably short for caliber. It was drilled, rifled and chambered using standard tooling. After machining, numerous radial ports were drilled near muzzle. Typical port counts ranged from 16 to 20 total. The ports vented propellant gas into the surrounding expansion chamber. Those ports performed two connected ballistic functions simultaneously. They bled pressure away before bullet exit from barrel. They also reduced projectile velocity below the transonic region. The design assumed standard ammunition in both calibers. Porting therefore converted normally supersonic loads to subsonic equivalents. The suppressor forward section contained fixed baffles and wipes. Baffles were machined steel or alloy discs with apertures. Rubber wipes formed sacrificial sealing elements around projectile passage. Each wipe started with a tiny central cross slit. The first shot fully opened the slit around bullet. Gas dynamics through baffles were carefully modelled experimentally. There was no access to modern computational fluid dynamics. Instead, the engineers iterated hole sizes and chamber volumes. They measured sound levels relative to reference service pistols. Subjective listening panels supplemented primitive instrumentation of the period. Rubber wipe material selection required multiple procurement trials. Early natural rubber formulations degraded under stored compression. Oils from ammunition and cleaning materials accelerated breakdown. Modified compounds improved resilience while maintaining sufficient elasticity. Documentation shows periodic wipe replacements specified after limited firings. The core mechanism remained a simple locked rotating bolt. The rear of the tube carried a knurled knob. The operator gripped this knob for cycling operations. Rotation of approximately 90 degrees unlocked the bolt lugs. A straight pull to the rear withdrew the bolt. Cartridges fed from a detachable single-column magazine. This magazine also served as the primary hand grip. Without the magazine, the weapon resembled a tubular implement. The magazine well projected only minimally from the tube. A plastic shroud around the magazine enhanced the illusion. Grip panels used molded plastic similar to Bakelite. The surface texture imitated utilitarian tool handles. Screws and seams were visually simplified to reduce recognition. In some configurations, the grip could be removed. Carried separately, the tube resembled a bicycle pump. Two principal chamberings were authorized for production runs. The first used 7.65 by 17 mm .32 ACP ammunition. The second used 9 by 19 mm parabellum service ammunition. Magazine capacities differed between these two patterns respectively. The .32 variant typically accepted 7 to 8 rounds. The 9x19 variant generally accepted 6 cartridges in practice. Some documentation and surviving examples show lower official capacities. This likely reflected conservative reliability margins for clandestine tasks. Overcompression of springs was discouraged in field instructions. Effective employment ranges were deliberately limited in doctrine. Training notes emphasize ranges under 15 meters in practice. At such distances, point-of-aim deviation stayed acceptable. Beyond 25 meters, trajectory and dispersion reduced hit probability. Operators were urged to approach and fire at contact. The muzzle face was ground slightly concave by design. This curvature assisted firm placement against fabric or flesh. Contact shots minimized lateral gas escape around muzzle circumference. This further reduced audible signature at typical operating distances. Contact firing also simplified aiming under low-light conditions. Sighting equipment was minimal but functional for short ranges, a small front blade aligned with an open notch. Sight elements often contained luminous material for night alignment. Paint with phosphorescent compounds was standard for that period. Sights were regulated for close-range center mass point of impact. The trigger system used a straightforward single-stage arrangement. Travel distance was short, brake weight moderate by design. A grip safety was integrated into the magazine housing. Unless this paddle was depressed, the trigger remained blocked. This prevented discharge if weapons slipped during close approach. Further, the weapon deliberately carried no visible national markings. Manufacturer names and inspection proofs were systematically omitted. Only minimal symbols and serial numbers appeared on frames. These markings were cryptic and non-attributable to specific factories. Such sanitization complicated enemy intelligence and forensic analysis. Production was distributed across at least one major contractor. Birmingham Small Arms Company manufactured significant quantities under secrecy. Additional unnamed facilities likely handled supplemental machining tasks. Component interchangeability was maintained through detailed drawing control. Gauge blocks and inspection fixtures set acceptable tolerance windows. Barrel blanks arrived as pre-forged cylindrical billets. Factories deep-hole drilled and reamed bores to design diameter. Button or broach rifling imparted the specified twist rate. Chamber dimensions copied previously standardized pistol cartridge blueprints. Barrels were then profiled, ported, deburred, and stress-relieved. The main outer tube required precise concentricity for alignment. Internal shoulders located barrel, expansion chamber, and baffle stack. Threads were single-point cut to maintain straightness under torque. Assemblers torqued collars to specified angular positions using fixtures. Witness marks allowed later armourers to detect loosening in service. Magazine fabrication followed typical stamped steel pistol practice. Sheet stock was cut, folded, and spot welded into box forms. Feed lips were formed using hardened mandrels and gauged afterwards. Springs used oil-tempered wire wound to controlled free length. Base plates locked using simple tabs to ease disassembly. Plastic grip shells were compression molded under heat and pressure. Pigments produced a dark, non-reflective surface appearance. Mold cavities incorporated grip serrations and minimal identifying text. Post-mold machining trimmed flashing and drilled screw bosses. Each shell was test-fitted on sample magazines before bulk use. Bolt bodies began as turned cylindrical steel blanks. Lug races, locking faces, and cam paths were milled. The rear knob was knurled for reliable gloved handling. Firing pins were separate hardened components pinned into bolts. Hemisphere-shaped pin tips reduced primer piercing risk under pressure. Before assembly, all parts passed dimensional and hardness inspections. Go and no-go gauges verified critical diameters and clearances. As Rockwell tests checked that heat treatment achieved specified ranges. Rejected components were scrapped rather than reworked for secrecy. Records show emphasis on consistency over cost in classified budgets. Assembly lines resembled conventional small arms workshops externally. Inside, operations followed compartmentalized security protocols. Workers only saw sub-assemblies relevant to their station. Documentation referenced part numbers rather than full weapon nomenclature. Completed units moved in sealed containers to government depots. Proof testing involved overpressure cartridges fired in controlled enclosures. Each Welrod underwent at least one high-pressure test shot. Inspectors examined tubes and threads for any yielding or cracking. Only then were suppressor internals and rubber wipes installed. This sequence avoided unnecessary damage during proofing cycles. Noise testing occurred in enclosed indoor ranges with instrumentation. Microphones compared the Welrod signature to service pistols. Reports describe reductions sufficient to mask origin beyond meters. Some trials measured discharge levels near ambient urban background. Test conditions included contact shots into ballistic media blocks. Reliability trials focused on small sample lots under repetition. Operators cycled bolts and fired full magazines repeatedly. They evaluated feeding geometry with both calibers and ammunition lots. Carbon fouling, rubber wear, and moisture exposure were assessed. Results shaped maintenance intervals and recommended maximum shot counts. The manual of use was short and highly functional. And it emphasized safe bolt operation and grip safety engagement. Users were instructed to carry on safe with empty chamber. Loading before contact was preferable to continuous ready carry. Unfamiliar personnel were not permitted to handle the weapon. Instructions specified minimal field maintenance procedures for operatives. Exterior metal surfaces required light oil to prevent corrosion. Internal suppressor sections were not to be disassembled casually. Rubber wipes could be replaced only with authorized spares. Improvised materials were discouraged due to unpredictable gas behavior. Logistical chains treated the Welrod as expendable equipment. In several theaters, units were not expected to be recovered. Coded crates delivered weapons with limited spares and ammunition. Accompanying paperwork contained no descriptive photographs or diagrams. Cover stories described contents as specialized industrial instruments. Ammunition allocation focused on standard rounds within each caliber. No dedicated bespoke cartridge design reached widespread adoption. Instead, ported barrels produced desired subsonic velocities from stock. This simplified supply but increased fouling inside expansion chambers. Records mention occasional preference for particular commercial loadings. Within the British system, procurement bypassed some standard committees. Security classifications restricted circulation of complete project files. Budget lines appeared under generic research or experimental headings. This reduced scrutiny from officers focused on conventional armaments. As a result, unit costs remained comparatively high per weapon. Alternative suppressed weapon options were considered in parallel programs. The Delisle carbine addressed longer-range sentry elimination tasks. Suppressed service pistols existed using detachable silencers on barrels. These systems lacked the Welrod's extreme sound reduction levels. They also presented more recognizable outlines if visually inspected. Engineers evaluated ring airfoil and captive piston ammunition concepts. These promised very low acoustic signatures without large suppressors. Manufacturing complexity made them unsuitable for rapid wartime production. Experimental trial quantities did not progress to operational deployment. Welrod therefore occupied the niche of simplest practical assassination weapon. An operational doctrine constrained how often Welrods were actually issued. Only selected missions justified use of such specialized equipment. Many resistance groups continued using captured conventional sidearms instead. Those weapons were easier to replace in case of loss. Consequently, Welrod production numbers remained modest versus mass arms. Reported uses span multiple theaters and time periods. Documentation references employment in occupied Europe during wartime. Later evidence suggests retained stocks for post-war special operations. The design persisted because its acoustic performance remained adequate. From an engineering perspective, the Welrod is a constrained optimization. Silence, concealability, and deniability outweighed sustained combat capability. Rate of fire was intentionally sacrificed for operational discretion. The magazine capacity was accepted as minimal relative to service pistols. Maintenance complexity concentrated in the suppressor rather than mechanism. Field reports noted handling characteristics under stress conditions. The absence of a traditional grip altered pointing behavior. Operators required rehearsal to achieve repeatable index and alignment. The bolt throw remained short and manageable in confined spaces. Rechambering noise was present but controllable between shots. Safety analyses considered potential failure modes under misuse. Obstruction of ports could elevate chamber pressures dangerously. Substitution of inappropriate ammunition could exceed design parameters. Manuals therefore cautioned against experimental load combinations in field. Contact shots against hard surfaces also risked structural damage. A bureaucratic correspondence around the program remained procedural and neutral. Minutes recorded delivery schedules, rejection rates, and storage conditions. There is little language addressing ethical dimensions of deployment. Discussion focused instead on reliability metrics and production throughput. Moral evaluation was largely external to the engineering documentation. From a manufacturing viewpoint, the Welrod simplified some processes. Straight tubular receivers avoided complex machining of slide profiles. Fixed suppressors removed the need for threaded pistol barrels. Yet tight alignment requirements raised scrap rates among early batches. Later production refinements stabilized yields within acceptable tolerances. Tooling investment was moderate compared with major small arms programs. Jigs for port drilling and baffle placement were specialized items. However, overall machine utilization fitted within existing capabilities. This compatibility simplified relocation if factories faced air attack. Security planners valued that contingency in wartime Britain. Storage protocols reflected sensitivity to moisture and rubber aging. Weapons were packed with desiccants and sealed wrappings. Periodic inspections checked for corrosion and wipe hardening. Unsatisfactory units were either refurbished or removed from issues. Documentation tracked lot numbers to maintain configuration awareness. Comparative trials with other suppressed systems remained ongoing. Data sets compared muzzle energy, sound level, and dispersion. The Welrod consistently traded energy for superior acoustic performance, and its projectiles retained lethality at the short intended ranges. Penetration tests against clothing and soft tissue simulants confirmed this. The internal layout also minimized visible moving parts externally. Only the rear knob and trigger interrupted the cylindrical form. There was no slide reciprocation or external hammer cocking. Observers unfamiliar with firearms frequently misidentified it as equipment. This misidentification satisfied one of the initial design briefs. Training documents instructed operators in staged familiarization sessions. Initial sessions covered safety mechanisms and unloading procedures. Subsequent sessions addressed one-handed and two-handed firing techniques. Final sessions incorporated movement, approach, and contact range employment. Live fire quantities remained low to preserve suppressor life. Occasional field modifications appeared in surviving examples and accounts. Some operators wrapped tubes with tape for additional grip. Others added improvised sights or reference marks for alignment. These changes rarely appeared in official photographic records. Central authorities discouraged unauthorized structural alterations in theatre. The Welrod's long-term legacy appears mainly in later designs. Modern integrally suppressed bolt-action pistols borrow its layout. Contemporary veterinary pistols mirror the combination of tube and grip. However, these successors operate in entirely different regulatory contexts. Their documentation is explicit, unlike wartime clandestine project files. From design proposal to service issue, the program was efficient. Development cycles were compressed by wartime urgency and narrow scope. Elimination of aesthetic considerations accelerated prototype fabrication cycles. User feedback loops were short, involving small specialized units. Adjustments were implemented without lengthy peacetime committee deliberations. In summary, the Welrod represents engineered alignment with specific tasks. Every observable feature corresponds to defined operational requirements. Its disadvantages are byproducts of those controlled design decisions. Understanding the weapon therefore clarifies the priorities of its creators. It remains a technical case study in applied clandestine engineering. Technical data cross-checked with multiple archival and museum sources.